We continue now at the top of Daf Tzadi Zayin Amid Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 97a. The Mishnah continues Hashvud v'asachla, which is the spit and the metal grill, Magilon b'cham, and if they're used with kodshim, so then you do Hagala, you purge them with hot water. Rashi says that over Gemara the Meseches Avodah Zarah, in the Gemara Meseches Avodah Zarah, parech halibun boy. The Gemara over there asks, why is it that you're purging it with hot water? You should require libun. It should be direct fire over there. That's addressed in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. And the Gemara says, my time with Rabbi Tarfon. What's the reason of Rabbi Tarfon? Again, Rabbi Tarfon in the Mishnah said that in a situation of a regel on the holiday, so then the process of scouring and rinsing, the process of marika and shtifa, that can take place after the regel. You don't have to do that every single time the kodshim are cooked inside the metal vessel. And the Gemara says, the Yomar Kra, the reason why Rabbi Tarfon says you can wait until the end of the regel is because the pasuk says, Ufanisa v'abokar v'holachta lo halacha. It says you're going to go in the morning to your tent. This is by Karvan Pesach. And hakosav aso lekulon bokar echad. Even though that's not the immediate morning that's following, but it's the morning after the yontiv is over. But still, it's all considered to be one boker. Therefore, you see again that the entire regel is like one boker. And so, in terms of the halacha of marika and shtifa as well, you can wait until the end of the regel. Rashi explains, it has to be the morning that is chol, that is going to be a weekday, that's not going to be yontiv, and that's called the boker rishon, that's called the first morning, and so therefore again, aso lekulon boker echad. Now according to this answer of the Gemara, it's coming from a pasuk, and so the Gemara says, Maskif lo Rav Achtavoy Barami. Rav Achtavoy Barami asks the following question, V'chi ein pigul beregel ve'ein noser beregel. Is there no pigul on the holiday? Is there no noser on the holiday? Meaning to say, if we're learning a general rule that the entire holiday is considered like a boker echad, so then there shouldn't be a halacha of pigul. If a person has an intention outside the proper time, but it's still within the regel, that should all be the proper time. Let's say it's left over, but it's still within the regel, it should still be within the proper time, but that's not true. Because v'chitema hachanami, if you're going to say that indeed that is true, that there's no pigul beregel, there's no noser beregel, v'atanya, but we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Nosson Omer, Rabbi Nosson says, Lo Amar Rabbi Tarfon Elozu Bilvad. Rabbi Tarfon said his halacha was only with regard to marika and shtifa. It's not a general halacha that applies to the regel for all of the halachas that could be related. And so the Gemara instead gives a different approach to Rabbi Tarfon. Elokid Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avua. Rather, it's like Rav Nachman said that Rabba bar Avua said. The Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avua, because Rav Nachman said that Rabba bar Avua said, Kol yom v'yom, each day, nasa giyol lechaveru, becomes a giyol. Essentially, it purges for the next day because you're constantly using these kalim, you're constantly using these vessels. Rashi explains, Ein pigul beregel, there's no pigul on the holiday. Are you going to say that? Im shachar al manas lechol lemocher, let's say, for example, a person slaughters with the intention to eat it tomorrow, ain't no pigul. Are you going to say that's not pigul? Ve'ein a noser beregel, are you going to say there's no noser beregel, meaning im hoser besar chatas lemocher, let's say he leaves over the meat of the chatas to the next day, ain't no noser, are you going to say it's not noser? The chad yomahu l'Rabbi Tarfon, because the whole regel is like one day according to Rabbi Tarfon, and you can't say that that is true. You can't say ein pigul beregel, ein noser beregel, because again, we said that Rabbi Tarfon only says it elozu belvad, only in this case. Le'inyan marika u'shtifa lechudah, he only said it from marika and shtifa. V'lo le'inyan pigul v'noser, he didn't say it with regards to pigul and noser. V'itaime mehai kro, now if the reason of Rabbi Tarfon was from this pasuk, afilu le'inyan pigul v'noser nami, the same should be true with regards to pigul and noser. And Rashi continues, the Gemara ultimately said that the reasoning of Rabbi Tarfon is kol yom v'yom nasa giyol lechaveru, every single day is a giyol for the next one, meaning as follows, mitoch sha'ashlamim mitsuyin beregel, since you're bringing many korban shlamim during the regel, during the holiday, so ein bolua shalon nasa noser, so whatever is absorbed in the vessel doesn't actually become noser, it doesn't actually become left over beyond the proper time. Sharei zman shlamim lebeiz yomim, because the amount of time that's allotted for a korban shlamim to eat it is 2 days. V'chim mevashal shlamim ha'idna, so let's say a person cooks shlamim right now, today, hadr mevashal be shlamim lamachar, he's going to cook in the same vessel a shlamim tomorrow. Uvoleya mishlamim shenishchetu b'yom ha'machar, so it's going to absorb from the new shlamim that was slaughtered the next day, meaning the following day. Upolein mashabola esmol, and then it's going to release whatever it absorbed the yesterday, the day before. Uboleya min ha'achronim, it's always going to be absorbing from what is the latter one. So nimsa she'eno bali de noser, so it comes out based on the usage over the regel, it's never never going to really be a situation of nosur. V'im bo levashel chatos. Now let's say a person would end up cooking a chatos as opposed to a shlamim. So then zor levashel achar of shlamim bo bayom. So then he has to make sure to cook afterwards a shlamim that day. Upolet as chatos, and that way whatever was absorbed from the chatos will now be released. Uvoleya es shlamim, and then in terms of the shlamim, that new shlamim is going to be absorbed. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "V'chachamim omrim." The Chachamim, they argue with Rabbi Tarfon, and they say ad zman achila. They say you only have until the zman achila, which the Gemara will now explain in terms of the marika and shtifa, in terms of the scouring and the rinsing of the vessel. The Gemara says, "My kamar." What exactly are the Chachamim saying? Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua. Rav Nachman says that Rabba bar Avua says, "Mamtin la ad zman achila v'hadar avid la mariko shtifa." You wait until the zman achila, the time of the eating, and then you're going to do the marika and the shtifa, the scouring and the rinsing. And the Gemara says, "Menahani mili." From where do we know this? Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Abba Yosi ben Abba. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Abba Yosi ben Abba, "Ksiv umorak v'shutaf." It says in the pasuk morak v'shutaf. Uchsiv, and it's also written in the pasuk kol zochar b'kohanim yochal. All the male kohanim will eat it. And so haketzad, how so? What it means when you put those two psukim together about the achila and the morak v'shutaf, it means as follows: Mamtin la zman achila. You wait until the zman achila. We'll see Tosas in a moment in terms of what that means. V'hadar avid la mariko shtifa, and then you do the marika and the shtifa. Rashi explains haketzad, how so, meaning interpreting the pasuk. Kolomar, what the Gemara means to say is lama samchan hakosov. Why are we putting these two psukim next to each other? The first one umorak v'shutaf, and then the pasuk about kol zachar b'kohanim yochal. Lomar mamtin ad zman achila. It's to say that the person waits until the zman achila. Tosas explain mamtin lahem kol zman achila v'hadar avid mariko shtifa. That's a slightly different girsa than what we have. The girsa of Tosas is you wait the entire zman achila and then do the marika and shtifa. Tosas say, Ein lefarish, don't explain to marika ushtifa kodem sheyasa noser, that the marika and the shtifa are done before it actually becomes noser, kidei shelo yavo kachim lebeis apsul, so that the kachim shouldn't come to disqualification, to hamashma hacha, because it's mashma over here, the la'achar zman achila avid marika ushtifa, that it's after the zman achila that the marika and the shtifa is done. And Tosas do continue and note, umiu, nevertheless, yesh svarim de garsi mamtin lahu ad zman achila. There are svarim that have the girsa, the text of you wait until the zman achila, so that would fit a little more with what Tosas is saying not to explain. But nevertheless, Tosas go on to conclude, elavadai, rather you certainly should explain, lo chayev hakosav ad achar shenasa noser, that it's after it becomes noser that the marika and shtifa are done based on the pasuk. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, marika ke marika sakos. Scouring means that it's cleansed in the way that you would clean the inside of a cup. And shtifa ke shtifa sakos, the word shtifa, rinsing, that's the way one would rinse the outside of a cup. And the Gemara says, Tana Rabban, and the rabbis taught, marika ushtifa bitzona in divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says that marika and shtifa, they're both done with cold water. But chachamim omrim, and the chachamim say, marika bechamin. Marika is done with hot water. Ushtifa bitzona, and shtifa is done with cold water. The Gemara says, my time of the Rabbanon. What's the reason of the Rabbanon? Midi dahave agiule of de kochavim, because it's similar to any time we are kashering something, let's say vessels that come from ovdei kochavim, from idol worshippers, vessels that are not kosher. So of course that's done with hot water. So here also, marika is done with hot water. The Rebbe Amar Lach, now Rebbe will say to you, Hagola lo koamina, I'm not talking about the Hagola. The Hagola is a different stage in the process. Ki koamina le marika ushtifa de basar Hagola. I'm talking about the marika and shtifa that take place specifically over here with kachim, that's done after the Hagola. And the Gemara continues, V'Rabbanan, and the Rabbanan respond to Rebbe, Imkain, if so, if marika and shtifa were both bitzonein, so lichtov kra, so the pasuk should write, O morak morak, O shutaf shutaf, it should use the word morak twice, or the word shutaf twice, because essentially it's the same thing. Mai morak v'shutaf, why use a different word? Why say morak and then say shutaf? And the reason is, again, according to the Rabbanan, because it's different kinds of water. Marika is bechamin, marika is with hot water, and shtifa is bitzonein, shtifa is with cold water. Shmami, no, we see from here again, marika bechamin ushtifa bitzonin, that marika is with hot water and shtifa is with cold water. The Rebbe, now Rebbe responds to that, ichsivu morak morak, if it would say morak twice, havamina trei zimne morak, oh trei zimne shutaf, I would think either do 2 times morak or 2 times shutaf. Lakach ksiv umorak v'shutaf, that's why it uses different terms, different words. Lomar lach, to say to you, marika ke marika sakos, that marika means like marika sakos, and shtifa ke shtifa sakos, and shtifa means keshtifa sakos. And Rashi explains, Midi dehavi agiulei of de kochavim, according to the Chachamim, Marikas with hot water, because it's similar to giulei of de kochavim, the kashering process, the chamin ba'inam, because their hot water is needed. Dechsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, kol davar asher yavo ba'esh, anything that's used with fire is kashered with fire. And im kain de tarvayu chodahi, if they're both the same, as Rebbe contends, so umarika lav hainu hagola, that marika is not hagola, so lichtov kra lashon shava b'shneim, it should be the same word. The Torah should use the same word by both. Hachi garsinanu my morak v'shutav shmamino marika b'cham and shtifa b'tzonen. Again, the fact that it's different words according to the Chachamim shows that marika is b'chamin and shtifa is b'tzonen. But v'Rebbe Amar Lach, Rebbe says to you, marika kemarika sakos, that marika, that's kemarika sakos, meaning that is from the inside. Ushtifa keshtifa sakos, and shtifa refers to shtifa sakos, which is from the outside. Lakach shina b'lashon, and that's why the language changes. Shazem yibachutz v'zem yibafnim, because again, this is on the outside and this is on the inside. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Bishal bo kachim v'chulin, if within one vessel was cooked both kachim and chulin, o kachei kachim v'kachim kalim, or both kachei kachim and kachim kalim, im yesh bohen benosein tam, if the one that is stricter, the one that's more holy, is able to impart its flavor to the other one, so hare hakalim necholin kechamurin shabahen, so then that which is more lenient, but it still has to be eaten according to the stringencies of the stricter of the two of them. Ve'enon tu'un and mariko shtifa, however, marika and shtifa are not required. We'll see Rashi in a moment. V'enon poslim b'maga, also the one that is more lenient is not going to disqualify through touching. Again, we'll see Rashi in a moment. And the Mishnah continues, Rokik shenaga b'rokik, if a wafer touches another wafer, the chaticha b'chaticha, or a cut of meat touches another cut of meat, lo kol harakikin v'lo kol hachatichos asurin. That doesn't mean that the entire wafer or the entire cut of meat is asur. Eino asur ela b'makom shebala. The isur, that which is prohibited, is only the area where it absorbed the flavor. And Rashi explains, Hare hakalim necholin kechamurin, again, that which is more lenient is eaten according to the rules of the stricter one, meaning, let's say, by kachei kachim, and the flavor of kachei kachim is imparted to the kachim kalim, so you have to follow the kachei kachim, meaning lifnim min hakloim, it has to be eaten within the curtains, meaning within the azara, and liyom v'layla, for a day and a night. Ve'ein tu'unin mariko shtifa, and there's no requirement, even though the more lenient has to be treated like the stricter one in terms of the way it's eaten, but there's no requirement of marika ushtifa according to the stricter one, meaning ve'ein tu'un and marika ushtifa l'sof zman achilas chamurim. It doesn't need marika and shtifa at the end of the time period of the stricter one, how that's eaten. Ela l'sof zman achilas kalim. Rather, it's at the end of the time period of the eating of the more lenient. Uv parach mai ka'amar, and the Gemara is going to ask on this, what is the Mishnah saying? Hare yesh bohen benosein tam, didn't it impart flavor? V'yamar hare hakalin necholin kechamur, aren't we treating the kalin, we're treating that which is more lenient as if it's strict, so in terms of marika and shtifa also, we should follow the same rules. V'yein poslin b'maga, and then the Mishnah also said they don't disqualify through touching, meaning im nifsalu hakalin, let's say the more lenient one became disqualified, v'naga bohen basar, and then meat touched it, uvala mehen, and absorbed from them, ein nifsal, and they don't become disqualified. Uva mafarish lan, the Gemara will explain this. And finally, rokik, let's say you have a wafer touches another wafer, means rokik pasul shehigia, but rokik kasher, there was a wafer that was disqualified, that touched one that was not disqualified, ubala mimenu, and it absorbs from it, so again, it's only going to be asr, the area that was absorbed. And the Gemara says, Mai ka'amar, what is the Mishnah saying? And the Bach puts in the words, Hachi ka'amar, this is what the Mishnah is saying, Im yesh bohen benosein tam, if it imparts flavor, so then hare hakalin necholin kechamurin, then that which is more lenient has to be eaten according to the rules of that which is more strict, because again, it got that flavor from the chamurin. U'tu'unin mariko shtifa, and mariko shtifa will be required, the scouring and the rinsing is required of the vessel, u'poslin b'maga, and they will disqualify through touching, because again, the flavor was imparted, so it follows all the rules of that which is stricter. But ein bohen benosein tam, but if it did not impart flavor, so then ein hakalin necholin kechamurim, the more lenient one is not eaten according to the rules of the stricter one. Ve'ein tu'unin mariko shtifa, there's no requirement of marika and shtifa. Ve'ein poslin b'maga, and they don't disqualify through touching. And the Gemara continues and asks, Nihida kachei kachim lo bo. Let's say by marika and shtifa we understand that it's not going to require marika or shtifa according to the timeline of the stricter one if flavor was was not imparted. So granted that as Kachei Kachim, that requirement doesn't exist, but Kachim Kalim Niboy, but there still is a requirement of Mariko Shtifa according to the timeline of how Kachim Kalim are eaten. So that should be required. Why does it say that if flavor is not imparted, there's no Mariko Shtifa at all? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Abaya, Abaya says, My Ein Tu'unin de Kamra. What does it mean when it says there's no requirement of Mariko Shtifa? It just means Kachei Kachim. It means there's no requirement according to the rules that guide Kachei Kachim. Aval Kachim Kalim Tu'unin, but in terms of the rules that guide Kachim Kalim, the Marika and Shtifa would be required, because of course we're talking here of Kachim Kalim. They didn't receive any flavor from the Kachei Kachim, but you have to follow the rules of Kachim Kalim. The Gemara continues with another answer. Rava Amar Rava says, Hamani Rabbi Shimon. Who's the author of the Mishnah? The author of the Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon. The Amar that says Kachim Kalim Ein Tu'unin Mariko Shtifa. Rabbi Shimon happens to say Kachim Kalim in general don't require Mariko Shtifa. So therefore, if the Kachim Kalim did not absorb any flavor from the Kachei Kachim, there's no requirement of Marika and Shtifa at all. The Gemara continues and says, B'shalom l'Rava, I understand according to Rava, Hainu dekatani o Kachei Kachim v'Kachim Kalim. That's why the Mishnah has two cases. It has a case of Kachim with Chulin and a case of Kachei Kachim with Kachim Kalim. We understand why both cases are listed in the Mishnah, because we want to teach that the Mishnah is following the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. The Kachim Kalim don't require Mariko Shtifa. Elali Abaya, but according to Abaya, Tarti Lamali, what's the point of having both of these cases? Essentially, they follow the exact same principle. The principle is that if the taste is imparted, you have to follow those rules. If not, you don't follow the rules. What are we adding by having both a case of Kachim and Chulin and also a case of Kachei Kachim and Kachim Kalim? And the Gemara says, according to Abaya Tzrichi, it is necessary to have both cases. The Itana Kachim v'Chulin, if the Mishnah only taught the case of Kachim and Chulin, Hava Amina, so one would have thought Chulin hu demevatli Kachim delav minayu. So one would say that Chulin and Kachim, they're not of the same type, and so therefore you have an idea of bittul, you have an idea of nullification. Aval Kachei Kachim v'Kachim Kalim emalo, by Kachei Kachim and Kachim Kalim, one would say not to say that. V'itana Kachei Kachim v'Kachim Kalim, if the Mishnah only had Kachei Kachim and Kachim Kalim, have Amina Kachim hu da'alime livatule. I would say the Kachim that's strong enough to nullify Kachim, that it can nullify Kachim. Aval Chulin emalo, but by Chulin I would say no. So tzricha, that's why it's necessary to have both cases. And Rashi explains, U'tu'unim Mariko Shtifa, again, Marika and Shtifa are required, Kedin HaChamurin, since it absorbed from the Chamurin, from the stricter one, it therefore follows the rule of Chamurin from Marika and Shtifa. U'poslan V'maga, and since it absorbed it, it's going to disqualify through touching, meaning, Im Hayu HaChamurin Psulin, let's say the stricter one was disqualified, V'hakalam Ksherim, and the more lenient one was kosher. Nasu HaKalam Kichamurin, now the lenient one will become like the stricter one. Livsol Es HaNogan Bohen, to disqualify what touches them. Kedechsiv, as it's written, Asher Yigab Evsori Yikdash. It says anything that touches Yikdash will be holy. V'yomer lekamon lios kamo, and the Gemara later will say that what that means is it becomes like what it touched. Shem psula tipasel, that if it touched something disqualified, it becomes disqualified. Vein tun and marika, if it doesn't absorb, so then marika is not needed. Lekame parach, the Gemara later is about to ask, and we saw in the Gemara liton miha kedin kalim lesof zman achilasan. At least the requirement should follow what the law would be by the more lenient one in terms of the end of their time period of eating. That's when the Marika and Shtifa should be done. Vein poslin b'maga, and they do not disqualify through touching. Im haya hachomer shenisbashel hakalin pasul. Let's say the stricter one that was cooked with the more lenient one is disqualified. Hoel umuat ve'ein bo benosen tam bekalin. Since it's so small, it doesn't impart any flavor, any taste to the more lenient one. Lo nasu hakalim kamo lifsol esanogan bohen. So the more lenient one doesn't become the same and doesn't disqualify what touches them. Sharei afheim lo nifselu, because they themselves don't become disqualified. V'aydi the tzana reisha poslin not got seifa ein poslin. Since the beginning of the Mishnah said they do disqualify, so we have a case at the end where they don't disqualify. The Gemara then said, "Nehid kachei kachim lobo." Granted that in terms of Marika and Shtifa, you don't have to do it according to the rules of kachei kachim. Kilomar nehid lobo Marika lesof zman achilas chamur. Granted that Marika is not needed at the end of the time period of the eating of the more strict one. To hamuatinu batli, because again it was so little that it was nullified. But niboy mia mishum kalim lesof zman achilasim. But at the end of the time period of eating the kalim, the more lenient one, that's when Marika and Shtifa should be done. And then the Gemara said, "Hainu detana o kachei kachim kachim v'kachim kalim. We understand according to Rava why we have both the case of kachim and chulin and the case of kachim and kachim kalim. Lashmin and the Sasamlan Rabbi Shimon. That way the Mishnah teaches us that the unattributed Mishnah is following the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. The Amar kachim kalim ain't tunin Mariko shtifa. Rabbi Shimon says kachim kalim don't require Marika and shtifa. Elali Abaya the Amar mai ain't tunin the Amar kedin chamurin. According to Abaya, that it just means it doesn't have the requirement as chamurin. It's just going to be treated as kalin, as the kalim as the more lenient. So tarti lamali, why do you need both? What is the point of lemisni having both cases? Kevan the tana kachim v'chulin be'ashminan de batal b'miuto. Since you already said there's a concept of bittul of nullification, malihani. What's the difference if it's kachim and chulin? What's the difference if it's kachim and kachim kalim? And again, the Gemara said that if you only had the case of kachim and chulin, so I would say that in a situation of kachim and chulin, then you have a concept of bittul because it's not of the same type. Maybe that's not true by kachim and kachim kalim. And again, if you only had kachim and kachim kalim, I would say that kachim is strong enough again to be mevatel kachim. You have a concept of nullification there, but you don't have that by chulin and kachim. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Rokik shehigia berokik, if a disqualified wafer touches a wafer that is kosher, so then only the area where it absorbed the flavor, that's where we say it's usher, not the entire thing. The Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Kol asher yiga, anything that touches, Yachol afilo shelo bala, one might think even the part that didn't absorb. Talmud lomer bivasara, the pasuk says bivasara, it's meat, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Zayin Amid Beis.